Thank you all for joining us for today's briefing. We are very excited to have you here to learn more about the work on House rules for the 117th Congress. We have more folks joining, but if you can please mute yourself, or we may already be muting folks as you're jumping in. We're happy to have you all join. Just to let you know, we will be taking questions. You may add them to the chat, and we will take those questions when we have those sections open. But for now, we're excited to have you join us for our briefing to talk about House rules. Yes, I know this is a policy wonk kind of issue, but it has huge implications for the work moving forward of building a better America for all, of passing progressive legislation and policy that reaches all of our communities. So we'll be talking about rules changes that have happened for this session of Congress. What does it actually mean for the legislation and policies that many of us are fighting for? And we're going to talk a little bit more about how this is a first step, how many advocates are pushing for continuing to improve how Congress truly works for the people. I'm proud to be here on behalf of our sponsoring organizations for this panel, which include the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, United We Dream, Public Citizen, and Demand Progress. And you'll get to meet some of our amazing speakers and panelists very soon. So again, I just want to remind you that before we jump in and I introduce our special guest, you do have there is a Q&A function that you are able to use. You should be able to use the Zoom chat function to send in questions. And once we start the question moderation section, we'll take a look at what questions we get to answer. But without further ado, I am so excited to introduce our special guest for today's briefing. Congresswoman Scanlon is the representative for Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District. She currently serves as Vice Chair of the House Judiciary Committee and is also on the House Rules Committee and the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Now, through Rep. Scanlon's work on House Rules Committee, she has been a huge advocate for reforming the rules package and being one of the champions to get it to the place that it is now, as well as making it more inclusive and streamlined. Notably, I want to shout out Rep. Scanlon for the championing of adopting gender-neutral language in the rules package, as well as reforming the motion to recommit, which you will hear more about in our panel. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the Congresswoman.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the very wonky subject of House rules, since it does cover everything from whether or not members have to wear masks to really important things like pay-go and modernization of Congress, et cetera. So, you know, we did have some great changes this year with the package, thanks to the dedicated efforts of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and caucus member and Rules Committee Chairman, Jim McGovern. So the House was able to pass a rules package that is going to enable Congress to really try to meet the needs of the American people without being bound to some of the outdated austerity requirements and gotcha votes, et cetera. So I'll highlight a few of these changes before turning it over to the panel. You know, with the CPC, obviously pay-go is always a topic of interest because it has been used in the past to thwart bold progressive change. So the rules package this time ensures that Congress can respond to some of the dealing with the climate crisis and the coronavirus pandemic by exempting legislation in those arenas from the budget rules. And this was a hard-fought change. It came as a direct result of efforts of many of the people on this call, and certainly from the CPC. We know we're going to hear more about it from the panelists, but this was a significant progressive victory in this package, and one that we know was really needed as we try to move to meet everyone's needs crisis. Something that impacts us more kind of on a day-to-day basis in Congress is the motion to recommit, which has been used extremely successfully by the Republican caucus, not just in the most recent Congress, but before that, to really try to have a gotcha vote, something they can use for their members to run against progressive members on. So I've only been in Congress 2 years before this, but with every significant bill, there would be a motion to recommit that would make it appear that someone was speaking out against or speaking out in favor of anti-Semitism, or, just all kinds of crazy things. There were usually immigration implications or something like that, but it was always a gotcha vote, always something just to try to get Democrats and particularly progressives on the record for something that would sound bad to their base or could be used to whip up the other side. Not that even if it would pass, that the Republican caucus would then vote for the underlying bill. So it has in recent years been treated by the Republican caucus as simply a procedural vote. And we think the changes that were made this time are going to make it easier for members of the Democratic caucus to treat it as a procedural vote, because it will tank any bill that is proceeding through. It's not a simple amendment anymore. And we think that's going to help limit the abuse that can be done with it. Diversity issues, that's been something that we worked a lot on in the last Congress with the Select Committee to Modernize Congress. So the rules package makes permanent the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and requires it to develop some best practices and a system for the House to track whether or not we're making progress in making sure that the House reflects the diversity of the country. We also included a provision that was championed by Demand Progress to require committees to include in their oversight plans a discussion on how their work will combat race, gender, and other inequities. And as you mentioned, we changed the pronouns and family relationships in the House rules to become gender neutral, so that all gender identities are respected. And then we also got props for making the rules much shorter by making it gender neutral. So some efficiency was built in there by accident. Truth in testimony is another piece. It takes a reform from the Select Committee to require witnesses to disclose the sources of funding and the nature of their work. Again, to make sure that people know what is appearing before them and what is the true nature. Some other things that were of interest, particularly to me from judiciary and for some of the impeachment work that occurred last time, there are strengthened provisions with respect to whistleblowers so that their identities can't be disclosed. And then with respect to subpoenas, we are still trying to enforce subpoenas against the former administration, such as Don McGahn, from the White House counsel. And one of the arguments that had been made is that subpoenas from 100 in Congress lapse. It doesn't matter. Survey confirmed, reconfirmed in this rules package that, of course, the subpoenas would remain valid and would be this content. So those are just some of the many things. There's also technology changes to update, again, RAGCOM 20th, not the 21st century. But a lot of hard work went into it from folks from the Progressive Caucus, and I think we made some significant progresses. So thank you all for being interested in the rules package. It is important to and we're pleased that we were able to make some significant progress in these areas this time. So thank you, and enjoy the deep dive into it.
Thank you, Rep. Scanlon. Thank you so much for joining us today and for giving that amazing opening in terms of that summary on what we've won and what work there continues to be on the way to ensure not only implementation, but more positive steps forward. So now we're going to get started with our panel. I'm excited to introduce you all to our folks here, advocates who have been working to make these changes a reality and who are doing the work to take us forward with more transformative changes to the way our legislative processes work for the people. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Hayward, who serves as the Legislative Affairs Director at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center and also leads the Unrig the Rules project. Matt previously worked as Legislative Director and Floor Assistant to Rep. Jan Schakowsky and Legislative Assistant to Senator Al Franken. Matt?
Thanks so much, and thank you to the Congresswoman for that great overview of the rules package. So I think what I and the other panelists are going to do is take a deeper dive into some of the things that the Congresswoman just mentioned. You know, people often talk about the congressional rules like they're fixed, but they're not. You know, the House votes on its rules at the beginning of every Congress, and that vote on the rules package helps determine what legislation can move, what legislation can't move. It determines who the system works for and who it works against. And this year, the House voted to make it easier to pass critical legislation, thanks to the work of a bunch of advocacy organizations, members like Congresswoman Scanlon and Chair McGovern. The two areas that I want to take a deeper dive on are the motion to recommit and the House pay-go rule. So the motion to recommit, or the MTR, is the last motion that's in order on a bill before the vote on final passage. And prior to this Congress, the minority could offer two types of MTRs. There was the motion to recommit with instructions and the motion to recommit without instructions. The motion to recommit with instructions let the minority offer that last minute gotcha amendment that the Congresswoman was just talking about. You know, in the last Congress, the Republican minority often used these MTRs with instructions to bring up amendments on all of their favorite political targets. 1 in 6 of these MTRs were related to immigration. Other common themes included China, politicizing anti-Semitism, crime and policing, and reproductive health. Yeah, and these MTR votes regularly put members of Congress in the majority in a tough position. They either voted for poison pill amendments that were designed to obstruct the very bills they were trying to pass, or they voted against those amendments and faced misleading campaign ads. You know, I think what no one can argue about MTRs is that they were actually a tool for effective lawmaking. And the interesting thing is that Republicans, after their MTR was adopted, after their own amendment was adopted, were actually less likely to vote for the underlying bill. 10 fewer Republicans on average voted for bills after an MTR was adopted than voted for other bills passed in the Congress. So this year's rules package eliminated the MTR with instructions. However, the motion to recommit without instructions still remains in place. Eliminating the MTR with instructions is going to change the flow of floor debate in the Congress. If you watch the debates on C-SPAN a lot, it's going to look a little different. In previous years, after the general and amendment debate, a member of the minority party opposed to the bill would usually rise and offer an MTR with instructions. There would be about 10 minutes of debate, and then it would be voted on. And then if adopted, that underlying bill would be amended, and then the House would proceed to a vote on final passage. In the 17th Congress, it's going to look a little different. A member of the minority can only offer an MTR without instructions. That sends the bill back to committee. There's no legislative language attached. And the House will vote on that motion without any intervening debate. So given that the motion has no legislative text attached and it's purely a delay tactic, it should be pretty easy for the majority to defeat it. And after it's defeated, the House will immediately vote on final passage. So for those who support the underlying bills going across the House floor, or for anyone who cares about communities that were regularly targeted by MTRs, this change is going to be a great improvement. The second change that I want to dive in on is the new exception to the House pay-go rule. The House pay-go rule requires that every individual bill that increases direct spending or decreases revenue has offsets. Otherwise, it's subject to a point of order. The House Rules Committee can include language in rules structuring debate that waive those points of order, but pay-go, as it sits in the House rule, kind of embeds this flawed notion that deficit spending is always bad, regardless of the economic conditions or the value of the legislation being proposed. The rules package established some common sense exceptions to the House pay-go rule. Namely, it exempts legislation addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. In other words, the House rules now acknowledge that we should address two of the biggest existential crises that our world faces without forcing cuts to other programs. This isn't just better procedure, it's better economics. Stimulating our economy during a pandemic-driven recession and saving our planet are smart investments, especially given how low interest rates are. PAYGO is still going to cause some headaches in this Congress, though. While the House PAYGO was reformed, Senate has its own PAYGO rule. That still takes 60 votes to waive. And the House and Senate will be able to create exemptions to the Senate PAYGO rule by a simple majority in the upcoming budget resolutions. On top of that, there is also statutory PAYGO, which says that all bills enacted in a year cannot, in aggregate, increase the budget deficit. Otherwise, the Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act triggers across-the-board spending cuts known as sequestration on mandatory programs. Exempting legislation from statutory PAYGO takes 60 votes in the Senate. So the House took important steps forward to improve the legislative process, but other rules still rig the system to cut off economic stimulus too quickly and to underinvest in our future. Nevertheless, the House rules package created a slightly better process, and that will hopefully result in slightly better policy. So that's just a start of what the House did in its rules package. And for more on the ethics and oversight provisions, I'm going to pass it off to Craig Holman at Public Citizen. Craig's the leading expert on congressional ethics rules and played a key role in the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. And he has become my go-to resource on addressing corruption and money in politics. Craig?
Thank you very much, Matt. Yes, as you've all been hearing already, this is a very impressive rules package for the 117th Congress. It has some sweeping ethics reforms, it increases congressional accountability, and it's probably going to result in a House that's more inclusive than we've ever seen in history before. So a lot of good changes, a lot of good elements in this package. I want to emphasize it doesn't just offer new elements, it also clarifies existing rules that needed clarification. Foremost among those that needed clarification was subpoena authority. Trump and the White House claimed absolute executive privilege, asserting that Congress and congressional committees have no authority to subpoena the president, the vice president, or anyone in the White House. And instead of battling over that, this rules package makes it very clear that congressional subpoena authority applies to the president, vice president, White House, executive office of the president in their official or unofficial capacities. And so that just makes it really clear that the congressional subpoena authority does apply to the White House. Now, with that clarification, then Congress, instead of debating whether or not they actually have subpoena authority over the White House, if the White House refuses to abide by a subpoena, that gives Congress the ability to start taking immediate steps to try to enforce the subpoena authority rather than debating what the subpoena authority is. A second clarification that I really like, and it comes as no surprise with the Democratic House, is they reauthorize the Office of Congressional Ethics in one big swoop, and then clarified that membership on the board that oversees OCE can continue for a fourth term. That took away one of the obstacles of trying to get OCE running again. In the last congressional session, we had an issue as to whether or not the board members could continue serving. And so it shut down OCE for a temporary basis. That's not the case this time around. And then also another clarification is the new rules mandate compliance with the new ethics rules that members of Congress cannot serve on the boards of corporations, of publicly owned corporations. That rule has been adopted, but not necessarily complied to by all House members. It's in response to Representative Chris Collins, who used his membership on the corporate board for insider trading. This mandates the enforcement of those rules. There's also new ethics rules that are important here. One, a former member of Congress who's convicted of a felony will not be provided access to the House floor. Another one is, and this one is really important, it bans members from using manipulated materials or even deep fakes in social media or advertising. We had a case where Representative Paul Gosar, for instance, put on social media right during a crisis with Iran, President Obama is shaking hands with the Iranian president. The whole thing was fabricated, didn't exist. We had another case where Representative Scalise modified a video of an activist talking to Biden saying, you are going to redirect some funding into mental health. Scalise modified that video to say, you're going to redirect funding from police. And that was never said. It was modified. That bans that kind of activity. And it also bans a member of Congress from outing whistleblowers. We saw Senator Paul Rand go on the Senate floor and out a whistleblower that put a lot of political pressure on that whistleblower to remain silent. So a lot of good rules. There's even more to it, but that consumes my time. So I'd like to hand it off now to Daniel Schuman. He's Director of Demand Progress and who has really specialized in congressional rules throughout his career. Daniel?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed that overview. It's interesting how you put all the pieces together. I liked it a lot. So I'm here to talk about three sort of disparate things: diversity, select committees, and technology. And I won't be able to do as effective a deep dive as Craig and Matt did, because there's a lot of little things here, but all these little things add up to a lot. So on diversity, as you heard from Rep. Scanlon, of course, there were changes in the language itself in the House rules so that it doesn't refer to gender, but rather is just more inclusive language. But there are some other, in addition to that neutral language, there's a couple other sort of interesting things. One is something that she highlighted, which is the transformation of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion from something that was included in the separate orders to being included in the rules themselves. And this is a really good office. It will help, it in fact has been helping in terms of the pipeline for bringing more staff to the Hill. But one of the other things that it does is it's charged with, on an annual basis, on a either annual or biannual basis, doing a staff diversity survey, looking at staff pay and retention across staff. So we actually have a sense of what's happening inside the House of Representatives in terms of who's being recruited, how long they're staying, what their pay looks like, all those types of questions, which is something that Congress used to do 20, 30 years ago, but stopped doing in 2009 or 2010 and hadn't done since except for once. That will also in terms of diversity, there will be a review of diversity among witnesses before the committees, which is not something that we had looked at previously, so that you'll actually have a sense of how good a job do the committees do with respect to making sure that they hear from diverse voices and people from diverse backgrounds. They're going to look at how to do this, because this is something that's a little bit of a tricky matter to actually implement in one fell swoop, but it's certainly a step towards accomplishing that end, and it ties to one of the ethics items that were mentioned previously, which is just looking at sort of the witnesses generally speaking. In addition to diversity, so I think there are several select committees this time around. We seem to have the proliferation of select committees. But I'm going to talk about a special select committee, not special because it's special in my heart, not because it's special otherwise, which is the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which is making a repeat performance. It was created, of course, at the beginning of the 116th Congress. It was expected to exist for a year. It was extended to 2 years. It issued 97 recommendations on making the House and making Congress work better, and is back a second time around for another 2 years. Yuri Beckelman, who some of you may know from Rep. Takano's office, will be the new staff director for that committee. And they have just done a tremendous amount of work looking at the weeds in terms of what doesn't quite work right in the House and making recommendations to change it. Since they're coming back, they want to hear from all of you about how to make things better. The final piece that's within my remit to chat about is technology. And there's a lot that's going on there as well. And I sort of should hasten to say that there has been an ongoing path with every rules package, at least for the last 10 years that I've been engaged with the process, to address these issues and to make them better. We saw significant improvements that the Democrats led in the 116th. We'd also seen improvements from the Republicans in prior Congresses before that. So this is one of those issues that bridges the gap between the parties. One thing that is almost done, and I'm excited to have, and I've seen demos of this, is the comparative print project. Wouldn't you like to see in real time how an amendment changes a bill or a bill would change the law, where you can just push a button and you can see how that works? Well, the tool is mostly built at this point. It's really cool. It will save you tons and tons of time. They're working on sort of extending the rollout, and the House Rules expresses continued support both for this project and also for the idea that legislative information should be published as data so that you can build new and innovative tools on top of it so that you don't have to waste your time doing side-by-sides or tracking how a bill is moving, and you can spend more time focusing on your job. Another thing that is included in the rules package has to do with, in part, witness disclosures, but really with documents that committees handle themselves. The testimony that people submit, the votes, sort of other aspects and facets of that process. Right now, there isn't an easy way for committees to manage all of that, including to track things like the conflicts of interest that witnesses might have. So the clerk's office has been directed to continue their work to go and think about and rebuild and make better tools available for committees so they can better manage this process, and so that you and I can have a better understanding of who are the witnesses and what are their conflicts and what do the votes look like and things like that. We also see continuation of the e-hopper, so you don't have to run down and drop bills in the hopper, but now you can continue to file things online, extensions of remarks, all that other type of stuff that previously required in person that will not require in person now. We see continuation of proxy voting, but even better than that, there is also a move toward, so the Committee on House Administration has certified that it is appropriate to use remote voting, and it continues to that possibility, should there be a further certification, that there could be a fully remote voting process instead of this proxy voting process, which would mean that our lives will be much easier because you don't have to wait for 37 waves of people to come to the House floor at 15 minutes each. And you can actually sort of get on with the business of Congress. All amendments will be published online, not just amendments that have succeeded. And of course, there was the adoption of new communication standards that was included in the rules package as well. So there's a lot there. There's a lot more that we haven't talked about. There are, I think, 62 rules changes that we counted up that are relevant to things that you all might care about. So we're happy to answer questions. Please don't forget to put stuff in the Q&A because we'll certainly attend to it. And as you can tell, I really like the rules. So I'm just happy to be here talking about it with all of you. Thanks, Craig, for the introduction, and I'll kick it back to you to lead us on.
Thanks, Daniel. So before we move to question and answers, I wanted to introduce myself and the work that I do and how it's implicated by a lot of this. I serve as the Advocacy Director of United We Dream, the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network. I just realized my headphones aren't in, so you might hear me better now. I serve as the Advocacy Director of United We Dream, which is the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network. Now, I want to just say, upon hearing my fellow panelists speaking, I want to name that these rule changes are not just about making more efficient the legislative process or helping bring our legislative branch closer or more up to date when it comes to 21st century processes that I feel like the private sector is already there, public sector is still catching up. But the main point here is that a lot of these rule changes actually further democratize process and the way that legislation moves. Specifically, these are all rules and proposed changes for the future that would actually help move more swiftly and in a more efficient way, progressive legislation that helps people without hurting people. For years, United We Dream and the immigrant youth in our membership have led on campaigns for pathways to citizenship for immigrants and combating and shrinking agencies and systems that target immigrants for detention and deportation. In 2019, we led the charge on H.R. 6, the Dream and Promise Act, which, if passed into law, it would be the most expansive immigration legislation that has moved forward in decades and would provide pathway to citizenship for immigrant youth, including DACA recipients, as well as beneficiaries of temporary protected status. So with that said, in 2019, our people engaged in both a policy and political strategy to ensure the win that we were able to achieve, which was the passage of this legislation in a bipartisan manner through the House of Representatives. However, I do have to, I still have some nightmares about this, both in the Dream and Promise Act strategy and in many of the legislative moves that happened in this last session, which was the moment that we would hear about a motion to recommit coming to the floor, whether I was at my computer and was getting, news through the listservs, or actually more stressful, being in the gallery during the H.R. 6 vote and not knowing for the longest time what the MTR was until it was actually reported live on the floor. So you can imagine what this does, not just in terms of advocates and policy folks who are working to move the legislation, our baby, across the finish line, but imagine what it does to particularly thinking about immigrant youth in that gallery who are looking upon members of Congress to pass H.R. 6, the Dream and Promise Act, and hearing an anti-immigrant amendment named at the very last minute by Republicans in an attempt to completely shift or change the direction of legislation meant to be helpful and not harmful to immigrant communities. This has happened multiple times and not just on immigration legislation. Frankly, though, when it comes to MTRs and motions to recommit, as you heard from Matt, many of these gotcha amendments have focused on immigrants. And even on non-immigration related bills, they have been brought up, whether we were looking at immigration MTRs on gun violence prevention, democracy reform, election security, and COVID-19 relief. There was a sense of victory, not only in passing Dream and Promise, but in being able to pass it through the House without an MTR of defeating that. But I will say it gives me a sense of relief knowing that the teeth have been cut from motions to recommit for this session. But it also gives me a sense of hope that these rule changes have been set in motion to better the way that legislation works for all communities. I kind of have to laugh thinking back on how the old Schoolhouse Rock song of "I'm Just a Bill." That's a very top line, 30,000 foot view on how legislation moves. And I want to speak to the folks out there who are dabbling in this for the very first time. This matters. This is why United We Dream collaborated with Sunrise Movement and the CPCC on an op-ed in Teen Vogue to actually start talking to our folks, younger people, folks getting started in the legislative process and legislative advocacy on what implications these long-standing archaic rules in Congress have on progressive and bold legislation, because many advocates know this and feel this. There are times when we want to dream and fly high, and it can be because of some of these archaic rules, some of these built-in procedures that are meant to actually hinder and slow down progressive legislation, that we are fighting even harder to get our legislation passed. And that's a quick anecdote on how a bit of these rule changes actually have huge implications for progressive legislation, not just limited to pathways to citizenship for immigrant youth, but expansion of healthcare, climate justice, gun violence prevention, and even more. So we're going to move into our Q&A section. I've been seeing folks using the Q&A function to send in a few questions. You will see that at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A function, so please send them in. We'll get started with a very timely question. I'll start with Brian's question here. The House rules for the 117th session appear to leave unsolved the longstanding issue of congressional continuity. Particularly in light of COVID and the January 6th attacks, this is a significant problem. What is being done to address this? Dan, would you like to take that?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. I suspect that this is from Representative Baird. It's good to see you. Thank you for asking it. So for folks who don't know, Representative Baird has been a longtime advocate around continuity of Congress, and we had a very productive collaboration at the beginning of last year, basically trying to keep the House of Representatives and the Senate alive. And he has a very real concern, which is that there is a provision in the House rules that basically allows for a shrinking quorum. That if there's a circumstance where there's a catastrophic attack on the House of Representatives, that you hold a quorum call, and if members don't show up, you can basically reduce the quorum size so that it can continue to operate. And his concern, which is a real one, is that this is unconstitutional. Now, the Senate doesn't have this problem because if a number of senators were to die, you could have governors, or there's a process to appoint them. On the House side, that you don't have this. There's also sort of an intermediary concern, which is that if you can't assemble the members of Congress, in place to have a quorum, like how is it able to operate? And this is a problem that the Senate hasn't solved, but the House has solved partially through proxy voting. And the truth, unfortunately, Congressman Baird, as you know, is that the House hasn't tackled this issue. Your recommendation, which was to study this and find a way to address this problem, is in fact the right recommendation. But it's not something that was taken up in this particular passage. There still remains the problem that you faced. I mean, my first day on the Hill was 9/11, so I understand, right? If there is a catastrophic attack and many members of Congress are unable to assemble, there still is not a solution on the House side that would most likely be constitutional, allow the House to continue to function. So I really do appreciate the question, and thank you for raising it.
I do also want to thank the congressman. He was the one who drafted the original Stock Act that a number of us were involved in finally getting implemented. And so I appreciate your work, Congressman.
Thank you so much. And Congressman, my apologies. You know, speaking of democratization, Zoom really does democratize spaces. Thank you so much for joining us and for your work on this issue. I'll move to another question, and it's been mentioned here. Any new rules relating to reconciliation or any contemplated?
Definitely a lot of contemplated ones. I mean, the tricky thing with reconciliation is that unlike a lot of the rules that we've talked about, we were just talking about things that were done in the House rules package. Reconciliation actually requires a statutory change. The Byrd rule was formally adopted in legislation, and I believe that was 1990. Versions of the Byrd rule have existed in Senate precedent for well into the 80s. So, the tough thing is that the whole reason that we use reconciliation is so it only takes 50 votes in the Senate. To change the rules around reconciliation takes 60 votes in the Senate. So the barrier is a little higher to get that done. But I think when you're talking about reconciliation, I think you don't just talk about reconciliation in isolation. It's really part of the broader conversation about filibuster reform, because reconciliation has increasingly been used when one party has a majority in both chambers of Congress to get past the filibuster, which has really increased in recent decades. And honestly, it has accelerated basically every year that I've been around. I was working in the Senate when there was finally the showdown around nominations through the Obama administration that led to the move to get rid of the 60 vote threshold for nominations. And I think we're going to see a lot of trying to work with the existing rules and eventually we might see that Senate Democrats decide that they need to further reform the filibuster. In some ways, reforming the filibuster would be easier than reforming the reconciliation process, because you could do that through, through overruling the chair, through a 50 vote mechanism, rather than having to clear the current 60 vote obstacle for the filibuster and changing the reconciliation rules themselves.
And if I could quickly jump in again, I need to clarify something, because I see there's a question about the ban on manipulated materials and deep fakes. The original language of the rules package was an absolute ban on that, prohibiting members of Congress from manipulating materials and coming up with fabricated, social media videos. The final language directs the House Ethics Committee to address this problem. I would prefer to have seen an outright ban on it right away, but with the House Ethics Committee addressing the problem, it'll be more like on a case-by-case basis, and with the final report coming from the House Ethics Committee.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, all. I did want to ask a question more about the next steps. We've been alluding to these as first steps. So for you all, what additional changes would you like to see in the future when it comes to the continued reform of House rules?
I feel like Daniel's going to have a lot of thoughts on this one.
I do. So if you feel particularly bored one day and you want to work your way through recommendations, I forget the number now. We had something like 160 or 180 recommendations for modernizing the House rules that we gathered from a whole bunch of folks. And I will drop in the chat a link to those recommendations, but they're available at demandprogress.org/reports. So let me pick my two favorites, if that's all right. So one is, for many, many years, there used to be something that was called legislative member organizations, which is the precursor to caucuses. But unlike now, these entities had funded staff, and it didn't come out of your member representational budget. And what this meant is that members could collaborate with one another on a wide range of issues. So for example, the Democratic Study Group, which had a ton of Democratic members and a bunch of Republican members, came out of this, and that was the entity that was largely responsible for breaking the Southern Democratic control of the House, as well as for pushing a number of issues. So bringing back the ability for members to collaborate with each other on issues that they care about seems to be something that makes a lot of sense. The other one, and again, like picking among them is not so easy, but staff pay. Congressional staff are way underfunded, right? Staff earn 20% less on average than their executive branch counterparts. We spend $100 million a year less on congressional committees than we did 10 years ago. And a lot of that means that we don't sufficiently pay staff. It's difficult for them to stay around, and they end up all having to leave and become lobbyists like me. And while there's nothing wrong with becoming like me, it's much better for you to be on the Hill than to come out here and live in Arlington and do the things that I do. So the House rules can adjust this in a couple ways. One is there's a current limitation of 18 staffers per personal office, which is way too low. That number hasn't been changed since 1979. So just to deal with the constituent requests alone, like the capacity to deal with that has not been addressed. The second is that the top level of pay for a staffer is pegged at member pay, which is $174K a year, which doesn't necessarily make sense, particularly considering that member pay is also artificially down by 30K. And the third problem that relates to that is that the pay itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the House could look at things like pay bands. It could look at things like instantiating unionization so that staff can collectively bargain. Like, there's a lot of things that can be done here. We have a number of recommendations along those lines because we think that staff really are the lifeblood that makes the House and the Senate function. And you need to have the best capable, best resourced folks to help members of Congress do the people's business. So I guess that wasn't really two, but we'll call it two, and I'll stop there.
And I've got a couple favorites that I would like to see too, and one of them relates to a question that I see on the board there, and that's when it comes to subpoena authority. I mean, it's great that this rules package clarified that the Congress does have these authority to subpoena the president, vice president, and the White House, but it could have gone a little further. It could have actually set up a very strong enforcement mechanism for that. Congress will, if the executive branch refuses to comply to a subpoena, Congress will still have to go to the courts to try to get enforcement of that subpoena. This rules package could have set up an expedited court review system so that the courts just drop everything and start dealing with the subpoena authority. Or it could have even specified that government funds will be withheld against anybody or entity or you know, anyone who refuses to comply with the subpoena authority. So it could have set up an enforcement mechanism within itself, and that it hasn't done. However, it did clarify that yes, Congress can subpoena the president. The second thing I would have liked to have seen, also relates to subpoena, is to give the Office of Congressional Ethics subpoena authority. We have been struggling to try to get OCE, the mechanism to compel testimony before when it investigates allegations of ethics violations. It doesn't have that authority, but you know, it can apply public pressure on members and staff to testify, but it should actually have that subpoena authority.
I'll just add very briefly, I want to underscore everything that Daniel said about staff pay, and particularly the point on unionization. There were some rules proposed around unionization back in the 90s, and they just kind of got shelved. And I think especially right now, when we're looking at all of the health concerns around COVID, the safety concerns, especially after the attack on January 6th, the chronic issues around harassment, around pay, I think, you know, the recipe for this anywhere else would be collective bargaining and unionization. The tough thing that's going to be is Congress writes its own rules, and in the case of unionization, that's asking the managers to vote to let the workers organize. But I think if members are voting for legislation like the PRO Act, they should also take a look in the mirror and see if they're giving those rights to their own employees.
Thanks all. We have a few more questions before we start to wrap up. I wanted to turn it back to you, Matt, on this question to start off. Does the new rules package make any changes to how committee assignments are awarded?
Yeah, so usually the rules package deals with what the committees are. So, you know, it creates the various select committees, but then the actual assignments are done by the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference, and both the caucus and the conference have their own internal rules for how those are divvied up. We're actually doing a bunch of analysis over at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center right now on the ideological balance of committees, on the diversity and the gender balance in committees. And I think it's going to be no surprise that you take Congress, which already isn't exactly representative of the country itself, and then when you look at certain committees, it's even further off. Looking at ideological balance, progressives are very underrepresented on foreign policy related committees. You know, you have actually many fewer members of color on the Appropriations Committee that controls the money. So I think these are something, you know, it might not be done through the House rules per se, but as a first step, it's good that the caucuses are actually starting to make their rules public so that we can scrutinize what they are. But I think there needs to be a little more pressure inside and outside of Congress to make sure that committees are actually representing the composition of Congress and the country more generally.
Can I add just one quick thing to that, or maybe two very quick things? One is that it's important for the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference to make available, and it's really the Democratic Caucus. They are now finally publishing their caucus rules. We spent a lot of time asking them to do so. But the steering committee, which actually makes the assignments, still operates entirely in secret. And there is value in having a better understanding, one, of who is on it and sort of how it makes its determinations. The other thing that I would point to, and I agree, I think I'm sure I agree with everything that Matt said, is the select committee process as well. So we have a particular bone to pick with respect to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which is a select committee, so the speaker and the minority leader pick its composition. And that leads to anomalous results in terms of who serves on that committee. Matt's team's research, for example, talks about the ideological skew, which is obvious that comes from those committees. But there are other issues that arise as well. Having more of a standard process, having go through the select committee, the steering committee process, and thinking about how the steering committees function. It's outside the scope of today's conversation, but it's one of those rules things that matters a lot. Because as we all know, personnel is policy, and we need to make sure that we have the right personnel in the right places.
I definitely agree. I can't restate that enough in terms of like the role that I play in representing a lot of immigrant youth, undocumented families, and trying to find the champions on the inside who will move on behalf of our priorities, no matter where they are. And, you know, frankly, immigration does get pigeonholed to judiciary, but there is such a diversity of opportunities when it comes to having the right people and people who are more attuned to issues of immigration, but more largely racial equity and justice when it comes to committees like oversight reform, finance, appropriations, and even more that I'm not naming here. I completely agree on that saying on personnel is policy. It has made a huge difference when we've seen it happen, and you know we can do the work both on the inside and the outside to push for the people that we feel can truly champion our communities in places of power. Craig, were you going to add anything? I saw you were unmuted.
I actually wanted to address a separate question that
Okay, go for it.
It's about earmarks. You know, I've worked with an eclectic group of K Street lobbyists like Rich Gold, Republican lawmakers like Jim Walsh, Melanie Sloan, several years ago, and trying to develop a clean system of earmarks. And we came up with a proposal. I mean, earmarks poses a problem if there's a conflict of interest going on, if earmarks are awarded to campaign contributors in particular. And that was the major abuse going on. We came out with a proposal, sort of like a pay-to-play proposal, that the House should have earmark authority, but no one can earmark funds to a campaign contributor. So you remove the campaign contributions out of the equation, and that would clean up the earmarking system. Now, this rules package did not address earmarks, but there is a big push within the House from both parties to try to reestablish some system of earmarks. We don't want the old system. And by the way, this eclectic group that I worked with, we were labeled by roll call as the Dead Earmark Society. But, you know, I would like to see a system of earmarks reestablished that is a clean system that avoids the conflicts of interest of the old corrupt system of earmarks. I don't know if Congress is going to go that far, but there's a big push for it.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Craig said there. You know, I think I came to the Hill at the very tail end of earmarks, and you know, I think there's the news stories that we're aware of with earmarks, but there's also the reality that it is a way to direct spending to important projects around the country. And in place of earmarks, what we've gotten instead is this system where agencies are making the decision, where, you know, lawmakers are sending letters to the agencies trying to weigh in on the process. So I don't know if we got rid of earmarks, but we kind of got a very convoluted system in its place. And I think putting in place a more transparent, conflict-free version of an earmark system like Craig's talking about would be a great improvement to both the old earmark system and this system that we have currently.
I'd like to add just sort of one thing on top of that as well, since we're all doing it anyway, which is that as you look at earmarks, there's also a question of how it affects or distorts the decision-making process itself. So if earmarks are decided by leadership, then the desire to go along with what leadership wants, there can be sort of a significant log rolling effect there. So in addition to, what Craig has rightly pointed out, that, about going to campaign contributors, or we saw what Dennis Hastert did in terms of enriching himself by putting a highway near his property and like all that type of stuff. There's also the concern of like, how does that affect questions around like what policy decisions are made? And one thing that we had suggested was that if 1% of federal discretionary spending is earmarks, what if you take that number and divide it by the number of members in the House, and you basically have a sum that attaches to that district, so that it's not a process where you have to go and play mother may I with the appropriators, but it's more a right that is available to the members to prioritize within their district while also going through a screen where you have an IG or someone else who looks at it to make sure that you don't have these conflicts of interest. There's a lot of interesting ways to play with the question of earmarks, and we should remember, as I think Matt was pointing out, faux marks exist, letter marks exist. We do earmarks which are done through taxes, right? So we just cut someone's taxes targeted, and it's a different way of getting. This type of distortion exists within the political space. We have to be very savvy about how we construct the responses. But fortunately, I think that the folks at the Rules Committee, who have been very open to all of our comments and feedback, I suspect that they would be very, very pleased to hear, along with the appropriators, any good suggestions that the folks out there watching might have.
Thank you. So I want to start closing out this amazing panel and this session that we've been able to have with all of you. Special thanks and gratitude to Matt of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, Craig of Public Citizen, Daniel of Demand Progress, and of course, Representative Scanlon for joining us to give us this really comprehensive take on what's happened so far, what is the update, what is it that you need to know about House rules, and what is the vision moving forward and how we can better and improve our system of legislation and moving policies forward. We know that from this conversation, the House of Representatives took important steps in the right direction. And you've also heard from our speakers frank takes on what it would take to get even more done, not only to improve how Congress functions, but to create conditions for swift passage of policies that help all of our communities, as well as the improving of conditions and ways to make more efficient the inner workings of our legislative branch. I also want to recognize that these changes did not happen overnight. As you've heard from our speakers, many of these have been a part of campaigns both inside and outside to pressure and move Congress to take these steps forward. And it's going to take a continuation of both inside strategy and outside pressure and tactics from the broader progressive movement to ensure that the rules, the personnel, the staff, the people who make up our legislative branch actually reflect the needs and desires of communities all across this country who are depending on Congress and our government to move forward bold policies that take care of our people. So with that, I'll just share a brief reminder that this will be posted. This video of the panel will be posted, and there will also be a follow-up to those who RSVP'd of documents, resources, and materials by various organizations represented here on this call to summarize and walk through a lot of what we have addressed today. Thank you again for your time. Thank you to the panelists, and have a great day.